I'm not going to say much, but welcome to you all to our event. It's, I think, the third in our series of PhD seminars, and we have with us today Father Joseph Matlak. I have the joy of supervising his research together with Dr. Augustine Cassidy, and Father Joseph, his doctoral research is focused on the relationship between celibacy, marriage, and the ministerial priesthood in Eastern and Western Christianity. He has a particular interest in the history and theology of Eastern Christianity. He completed a BA in Ancient History at King's College in London, and also a Masters of Divinity in Sacred Theology at the Catholic University of America in Washington. And this is very important to know beforehand, perhaps, he hopes that his research will provide a positive theological contribution to ongoing ecumenical dialogue between Eastern and Western Christianity. So there is an ecumenical component to Father Joseph's research. Without much further ado, Father Joseph, you have the floor, and then we'll have questions from the audience towards the end of the session.
Thank you very much, Razvan. I hope everyone can hear me okay. If you can, therefore, I am going to share the screen with you here. If you just give me a moment. So hopefully everyone can see that first slide. I don't want to rely too much on slides. However, I thought it might be helpful to guide me in keeping me on track. My research is centered on the question of the relationship between celibacy, marriage, and the priesthood, or more specifically, the ministerial priesthood in the Christian East and West. So I'm going to structure this brief presentation on the way I structured my dissertation, or intend to structure my dissertation, which is in 3 parts. The first part is going to deal with the background and context, and then eventually the second will deal with how the topic has been treated in the Latin or the Roman Catholic West, and finally to offer a suggestion based on Eastern Christian theology, how the Eastern churches might respond to the contemporary emphases within Roman Catholicism. So the first section, I'm going into the background and context, and before I begin, I want to say that this is it's designed to be a summary presentation, and the reason it is designed to be only a summary presentation is because the information, there's just too much to deal with. However, what I've decided to do is give this background and this context because it forms an important part of contemporary discussion. And I've divided that into 3 sections: the scriptural, the patristic, and canon law. And again, I can only go into these in summary fashion because each of these topics by themselves could produce multiple different studies. And in fact, they have. So what I didn't want to do in my research was to create another scriptural study or another patristic study or another canonical study. Those already exist, arguing for both points of view, and I'll explain that in a moment. But what I want to do is simply to lay out the state of the discussion. So in terms of the scriptural background to the question, we have to look at what are the precedents in the Old and the New Testament. So what were the earliest practices and what were the disciplines with regards to the ministerial priesthood and the association of celibacy and marriage to the priesthood? Well, to keep it very simply, the Old Testament priesthood, the priests were married, and were required to abstain during their time of service. The New Testament actually presumes that there are married ministers. So if we read the epistles, Timothy, Titus, for example, it speaks very clearly about ministers being the husband of one wife. Now, of course, how that's later interpreted is a different matter altogether, as we'll see. But it's what we see in the scriptural background is that the earliest practices and disciplines are simultaneously clear and obvious, and yet scholars disagree as to what exactly they mean. So, for example, the phrase, the husband of one wife, scholars in the history of Roman Catholicism have interpreted that in different ways than what it might sound as. It might sound that it's talking about the fact that a minister is married to one wife. But what does that mean? Some thinkers throughout the ages have thought that that means that someone who was ordained was required to live perpetually continent. So that's what we'll see in some of the Western authors. While those who disagree will say, no, that simply means that the man, the person to be ordained, was married. So there are some precedents in the scripture to the question that have to be taken into account, including Paul's own views of marriage, how marriage in and of itself was received and accepted into the early church, into the sacramental life of the church. That is bridged into the patristic section. When we look at how the earliest Christian writers treated of theological anthropology and sacramental theology, and how they viewed marriage, how marriage was placed in that very question, how marital sexuality, for example, was received, whether in a positive or in a negative way, is an important part of the discussion, because sometimes thinkers do bring those two matters together. So, for example, if marriage and marital sexuality were approached in a negative sense, then of course that's going to determine how some of them are going to express the appropriateness or inappropriateness of marriage and matrimonial sexuality for priests, if in the case that they are already married, and hence the application of continence. And finally, all of that, how that's internalized, how the scriptural evidence and how the patristic writers, how that is brought into the life of the church, is done in the history of the law, of the disciplines. And in this, we see interesting divergences between the East and the West. Not simply in how they approach the law, because in how the East and the West approaches the law can be very differently. For example, juridically versus medicinally, the East has often been described as approaching the law in a more medicinal way, whereas the West is often described as approaching it in a more jurisdictional and legalistic way. And of course, we do see eventual divergences in the law coming to a head at the council in Trullo in 692, when the current Eastern practice is, if you will, codified. But then again, scholars disagree exactly as to how ancient those laws are. Western scholars who argue very much for the apostolic origins of mandatory continence, if not celibacy, will argue that the Council of Trullo, and therefore the Eastern discipline, was an innovation, a rupture in the ancient apostolic tradition. Whereas Eastern authors might disagree with that and simply say that, no, there is a divergence at some point. They may argue in reverse, or they may simply be content to say that somehow the rupture happened, but we just don't know where. The East and the West simply developed differently. So I've provided those three summary sections, and they can only be summaries because there's a lot of information there, and the parameters of the study simply couldn't take note of how detailed each of these discussions are. Which is why I decided it would be very important to approach this from a systematic point of view. In essence, taking a bird's eye view, stepping out of the minutiae of each of these disciplines, and seeing how the situation came to be, looking at it from the bird's eye view. also from the point of view of ecumenical dialogue. Because here what we have, at least in terms of this study, is the dialogue between the Eastern Christian churches, the Orthodox churches, as well as the Roman Catholic Church, the largest of the Western Christian bodies. Because of the divergence in the debate, the Roman Catholic Church, that is very much in defense traditionally of celibacy, mandatory celibacy, and the disciplines of the Eastern churches, which witness to a different tradition, a tradition that goes back, one could argue, almost 2,000 years, perhaps even to the New Testament itself. And exactly how each of these areas, the scriptural, the patristic, and the canonical, how they play into the debate, it's important to give that kind of background. Now, having mentioned that, the second section is going to look at Latin or Roman Catholicism. It's important to pay special attention to this because of the way that the debate has been taken and the way that the discussion has developed within Roman Catholicism, especially in the second millennium. There has been a real shift in the approach and in the thought to the application of continence and celibacy to the priesthood. Now, I realize this is a very simplistic division, however, and that, by the way, that should say 1, 2, 3, so apologies for that. The way that I have decided to present it is that in the first section, I look at the way the relationship between celibacy and the priesthood was presented before the Second Vatican Council. And it was very clear that, as it had been in the first millennium, continence or celibacy was understood as being lived by priests for the sake of ritual purity. What does that mean, basically? It means that the liturgical service, the sacramental service of the priest was such that he was required to be pure, and that purity was attained not simply by, say, fasting from food, but by living continently in the case that he was married. Now, in the Latin West, if he were to be continent, that was understood as something being perpetual. In the East, even at the Council of Trullo, the priest who was required to be continent temporarily during his period of service. So this is something that we see in the first millennium, if I go back to the first section here, in the patristic era, as well as in the way that the disciplines were developed in canon law. That was the clear association, continence for ritual purity. I also took account of Thomas Aquinas and some of the scholastic tradition in how they approach marriage. Marriage had a very specific goal, and that was first and foremost to produce offspring, but also the relief of concupiscence, as it was described. And so therefore, the marital act was often described as a debitum, the conjugal debt that was to be rendered. Now, because a married priest, or a priest within the bonds of marriage, had to focus on ritual concerns, sacramental concerns and service, he was unable to pay that conjugal debt. And so when we see in the second millennium Roman Catholic writings, we see that marriage was seen as being inappropriate for priests, not because of something ontological or in and of itself, but it was described as being inappropriate because the priest could not render the conjugal debt. So if the priest's wife were to say, you must render me the conjugal debt, the priest would have to respond and say, no, I'm sacramentally bound to keep myself focused on what I'm doing. So I have to be continent in order to be ritually pure, if you will. But in this system, in the older system, celibacy was clearly a matter of discipline. It wasn't a matter of doctrine. And Aquinas himself describes that in his Summa Theologiae, that in the East they have a certain practice, whereas in the West they have another. But you emerge from that thinking, well, but the Western view, the Western way is better. Although he is aware of the Eastern tradition. Now, what happens in the Second Vatican Council and thereafter is there has been a theological shift. The priesthood has been described now in a much more Christological and ecclesiological and eschatological sense. So these three qualifiers were now given to describe the exact role and the meaning of the priesthood and of the celibacy of the priest. So celibacy was no longer something to be described as merely disciplinary, as merely for the sake of sacramental purity or ritual purity or readiness or practice. But it has to do with something deeply Christological now. So something about Christ, after which the priesthood is designed, seems to at least make celibacy appropriate, if not necessary, and that's sort of the next part. Ecclesiologically, the same thing. The priest is an ecclesiological being, so the sacramentality of his role is something that has to do with the meaning of the church, and therefore his celibacy expresses the same. It's an ecclesiological trait. And celibacy, finally, is something eschatological. So just as the priest is an eschatological being, has to do with the kingdom, the coming of the kingdom, so everything about him, including his celibacy, has to be described eschatologically. So this is the theological shift that has taken place since the 1960s. Certainly not without precedent, but very, very obviously in contemporary Roman Catholic theology. So celibacy is now no longer merely a matter of ecclesiastical discipline, but it's now given a theological defense. And the two great examples of this are Paul VI and John Paul II. So Paul VI in his encyclical in 1967, and the writings of John Paul II throughout his papacy, and in some senses John Paul even more strongly than Paul VI. Finally, I look at some contemporary theologians, Roman Catholic theologians, which have begun to use this word ontological. So celibacy is an ontological thing. In other words, it's not merely disciplinary in its connection to the priesthood. Now, what these theologians have tried to do is to build off of that theological shift that took place after Vatican II. However, the downside is that there have been consequent problems for the Eastern churches, despite the teachings of the magisterium that celibacy does not belong to the nature of the priesthood. And despite the canon law for Eastern churches in union with Rome, which specify very clearly that even the married priesthood is to be held in high honor. So what we have in essence is a problem. We have a theological issue whereby celibacy seems to belong to the nature of the priesthood, and at the same time, it doesn't belong to the nature of the priesthood. And I'm just going to give 3 examples of theologians that I have found speak to that. The first one is a French priest by the name of Father Laurent Touset. And Laurent Touset certainly takes after the theology of John Paul II, arguing that this association between celibacy and the priesthood is a dogmatic progression. So he uses the phrase dogmatic. It's something dogmatic. It has to do with doctrinal development, and it basically expresses an evolution that has taken place within Roman Catholicism, according to which, and his phrase is, the sacramental logic of celibacy is now being fully recognized. So there is a sacramental connection between celibacy and the priesthood that he argues was always there. In fact, he would very much argue for the apostolic origins, but that it's only now being fully recognized. So what he does is he criticizes the married priesthood. as a sort of a clericalism of the laity, which threatens the laity, and also he argues at one point it threatens marriages because he wants to keep the goodness of those two areas separately. He argues that the married priesthood betrays a deficiency in the understanding of the sacraments. I'll quote him here. A church indifferent to the matrimonial state of its clerics would perhaps reveal a debilitated faith in the virtue of the sacraments, especially the Eucharist. So in other words, if we would argue, as the magisterium actually does, that celibacy does not belong to the nature of the priesthood, then somehow there's a debilitated faith in the sacraments going on, especially the Eucharist. Touset also follows on from John Paul II in his nuptial identification of celibacy. So celibacy, to summarize it, is analogous to a spousal couple. So just as a man and woman marry and image thereby, the union between Christ and the church, so in Ephesians 5. So the celibate priest is married, if you will, in the place of Christ, is married to the church. And so there's sort of an analogous nuptial union there. And therefore, a married priesthood becomes almost like a contradiction in terms. It's unable to manifest what Touset calls the oblative logic of the ministry. If Christ is unable to be married exclusively to the church, and if the priest is in the presence of Christ and the priest is married, then he is unable to be married fully to the church, and therefore that the logic of who he is and what the sacrament of the priesthood is supposed to be about, he argues that's lost. And so therefore the married priest cannot fully reproduce the Eucharistic sacrifice of Christ. Well, I'm sure the next question is, well, what does that mean? Does that mean, therefore, that the Eucharist offered by a married priest is less Eucharistic than the Eucharist offered by a celibate priest? So in essence, Touset is going far beyond the teaching of the magisterium, but you could argue he is taking it to its logical conclusion. And at one point, he refers to a married priest as a passive instrument and a sacred puppet, almost like he's just there to produce grace. Whereas the priest must, he argues, incarnate the nuptial Eucharistic logic in his ministry. In other words, in himself. He has to be another Christ in order to image that nuptial union between Christ and the church. Otherwise, Touset argues his ministry is severely affected, at least theologically so. So that's one example. The second is Hans Urs von Balthasar, who wrote an article on the question of the viri probati, the idea that the Roman Church could begin to ordain older vocations to the priesthood. And he says, when St. Paul says, I wish all were like me, unmarried, he does not imply one of two alternatives, but unmistakably gives preference to one of the two, to a life thrown as a whole into the fire of Christ, ablaze like glowing iron. And he says this, the viri probati are cold iron, no matter how zealous they might be personally. Whereas the unmarried shepherd is the glowing iron, and he alone can communicate his radiance to others. Only the word and example of celibate priests can awaken the generosity of total dedication in young people. Orthodox and Uniates warn us of the illusion of a more effective apostolate by a married clergy. And the reasons for celibacy are centered in the positive revelation culminating in Christ. They are supernatural and can therefore be comprehended only by those whose faith is alive, who possess a sensorium for a Christian truth. This is not in contradiction to gratia supponit naturam. So what he's basically saying, it very clearly, is that a married priest is a cold iron that's unable to communicate fully his radiance to others, unable to awaken the generosity of total dedication, exercises a less effective apostolate, and is less supernatural, if you will. So he's looking at it from the point of view of eschatology as well. And in fact, he does it even more strongly by saying that it's not appropriate, in his opinion, to say, well, you have people who pronounce those evangelical counsels, those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the monks over here. No, he's actually saying that those things are part of the office of the priesthood. And when he does this, he monasticizes the priesthood. And so this is the issue, is that people will look at this and say, well, what we have here is in effect a collapsing of the two roles, one being a sacramental, so the priesthood, the ministerial priesthood, and the other is the evangelical councils, so the vows, the monastic state. Whereas von Balthasar is clearly saying that no, the origin of the two goes back to be even before their separation. So therefore, the priest is bound to make those evangelical counsels in the same way that monks do. The final theologian I'll give as an example is a little bit more current, is Robert Cardinal Sarah, who together with Pope Benedict XVI authored the book From the Depths of Our Hearts in order to advocate for the retention of priestly celibacy. And he does this by saying that celibacy has really a fourfold identity. Firstly, it's Eucharistic. And we saw this in Father Laurent Touset, that the priesthood demands celibacy because of the Eucharist. And because of his Eucharistic role, the matrimonial bond is therefore impossible for him. So in other words, you can't be married and serve the Eucharist at the same time. He also takes over the Christological and the ecclesiological role, the fact that Christ is married to the church, and therefore, in order to retain that awareness that Christ is married to the church, his representative, namely the priest, has to be exclusively married, if you will, exclusively devoted to the church. And therefore, Sarah argues, the church would no longer understand herself if she were no longer loved by celibate priests. So if the priests were no longer celibate, then the church would no longer be or understand who she is. And so derived from that is the spousal. And he says that the logic of the priesthood excludes any other spouse. So celibacy is a spousal thing. And he even argues, along with Touset, that interfering with that means to interfere, to injure the Christian meaning of marriage. So if a married priest, in essence, somehow harms Christian marriage. And finally, he uses the word ontological a number of times, as do other theologians, to say that it reveals the very essence of the priesthood. So the very essence of the priesthood and the very essence of priestly life, ontologically, that's in and of itself, requires that a priest be celibate. And I'll close by giving you a few quotes of what his opinion is of the Eastern churches. Only the presence of monks makes a married clergy acceptable to the people. He appeals to the sense of the faith. The faithful apparently discern some incompleteness in the clergy who are not celibate. Then he argues that the testimonies coming from the Eastern churches, and several members of those have emphasized that the priestly state came into tension with the married state. And he said that the modus operandi up till now is impossible because the Eastern married clergy is in crisis. And finally, when suggesting how to go forward, Sarah argues that in light of the statement of the recent magisterium on the ontological bond between priesthood and celibacy, so here we have again the magisterium in the Second Vatican Council saying it doesn't belong to the essence of the priesthood, but there are other statements here saying it somehow does. Sarah argues, I think that the purpose of this acceptance is to foster a gradual development towards the practice of celibacy, not by disciplinarian path, but for spiritual and pastoral reasons. So in essence, to put it in lay terms, the practice of the Eastern churches is to be tolerated until such time as they themselves, if you will, come to their theological and sacramental senses and do what we, the Latin Church, have been doing all along and are only now coming to realize even more deeply. So the final part of my thesis, of my dissertation, looks at what could be a response to this. And I've structured my response in two parts. Firstly, I have sought to give a proper understanding of monasticism and marriage and asceticism, because monasticism is the shared institutional manifestation of consecrated celibacy in both the Christian East and the West. It's the one institution that both the East and the West understand commonly as consecrated celibacy, lived as an ecclesial expression. And to show that there is a deep complementarity between monasticism and marriage, and therefore between monasticism and celibacy, and that the way properly to understand and respond to this contemporary Western or Roman Catholic understanding or approach is to focus on what the East understands monasticism to be, and whether the Western discipline could simply be a form of that. And secondly, to give a proper understanding of sacramental theology in view of all the other sacramental associations that are now given in the Latin West between celibacy and the priesthood, to understand from an Eastern perspective whether there is anything in our tradition that would help respond to that. There are two questions really that were in the back of my mind. In what way do marriage and sexuality fit into asceticism and sacramentality? Because they oftentimes are not fit. They oftentimes seem to be opposed to one another. In other words, if you wish to be truly ascetic, truly sacramental, then very often you have to be rid of your married side and your marital sexual side in order to prepare yourself to be truly ascetic and sacramental. Now, once we answer that question, we can then look at, is the marriage of the priest capable of doing this? So if a lay married person can be ascetic and sacramental, then can the marriage of the priest be capable of belonging to these same realities? In the first section, I think we really have to start by addressing various challenges, and that the one major challenge is that there are spiritual inequalities within the Eastern churches themselves. It's clear that in the Eastern tradition, monastic clergy are definitely preferred, for whatever reason, to the married clergy. We have to address that, and we have to understand why. But we have to understand, therefore, why monasticism has been given a preeminent role. We have to understand that monasticism has a fundamental root to it. And the fundamental root is that desire to be ascetic, to be devoted to one's baptism. But because of that, asceticism is something that can be applied to all. It's merely iconified in monasticism, but it is applicable to all without collapsing the married vocation. And this is where the complementarity comes in. Marriage is complementary to monasticism. It simply has a different form of living baptism, a different form of living that intensity. And so therefore it's necessary to recover a proper sense of asceticism. Asceticism is not negative. It's not the negation of marriage, the negation of marriage sexuality. It has positive motivations. It has positive theological and sacramental motivations. And therefore, I will argue for an expanded sense of asceticism, one that doesn't merely mimic monastic asceticism, but understands it to be iconic and applies it in the bounds of the married state in life. And finally, I look at the sacramental, the differences between the Eastern and the Western approaches. And part of that is grappling with, if I'm to quote Alexander Schneemann and Afanasiev, to grapple with this hard divide between what is sacred and what is profane. And then to understand in the Eastern tradition how the sacraments are, how they are properly meant to be approached. They're approached as liturgical and Eucharistic things whereby the church, transformed into the body of Christ by the Holy Spirit, enters into the kingdom and therefore brings matrimony in with it into the kingdom. So matrimony becomes a sacramentally eschatological state, a state that, yes, is of this world, but enters with the parties who are sacramentally married into the eschaton, into the kingdom. And therefore, it includes the priest who stands in the person of Christ and in the person of the church, because the priest also enters into the kingdom in the case of a married man, as a married man, or in the case of a celibate, as a non-married. And therefore, that our true asceticism, the true asceticism for this married reality, has to be something that's consistent with that. In other words, it can't deny it. It shouldn't deny it. It shouldn't efface it. It should be something that brings it along with it. And then I conclude by looking at the rite of marriage as something that clearly specifies this, clearly talks about how marriage enters into the kingdom. And therefore, not only is it not inappropriate for the priesthood and for sacramental life, it's actually something that's very appropriate for it and very much related to it. So my final goal will be to offer a unique theology on the married priesthood, yes, in humble recognition of its own shortcomings and difficulties that it's had to deal with, in a manner that is complementary to the theology of celibacy within Roman Catholicism, and therefore, hopefully, to find the kernel of truth that unites rather than divides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Joseph. Yes, I'm having some trouble. Can you hear me still? Okay, good. Thank you very much. For questions, we have some time for questions. And you could raise your physical hands because I can see all my screen. Okay. Or, thank you, Father Patrick, you're the first one. But you can also use the little hand, the raised hand icon so that I can see you in the participants. Okay, Father Patrick, go ahead.
Well, many questions or points to raise, but I'm wondering whether for an Eastern approach to the modern Roman Catholic position, it is interesting because it has evolved, and so it does make it interesting to try to target exactly what position you're talking about, to distinguish clearly and carefully between the celibacy or the as in the early church, the ritual purity, the restraint from sexual relations within marriage, from the act of marriage itself. I think that they've sort of seems to become conflated in the West, whereas I think it's important to distinguish these two, and they are sort of two distinct things in the way that we understand them in the mysteries and asceticism. And developing on that point, I think in the East, I think also that we need to be careful that we don't take monasticism as purely asceticism, but as mono, the act of being the angelic life, the being alone. And what does this mean in the mystery to Christ, as opposed to the couple, the union of man and wife, and what this relationship represents. And then just building on that, even still, I think we must also note in the East why we cannot marry after priesthood. So once someone has been ordained as a subdeacon, he can no longer marry. What does that mean about our understanding of the priesthood? And how does that relate to marriage? That it is okay before, but not okay afterwards. So I think, I'm not sure if you're bringing these out, but there's some points that I think, and just as to throw my own flag, my own PhD does work a lot about relationships, and it does talk about the way that our relationships affect our union with God from the marriage level right the way through to the hierarchical level, and how marriage relates to a priesthood. Sort of gives an idea of why there might be some reasons why you can't marry after, but you can before. So I just want to throw those out there for you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I do actually touch on those a little bit, starting with the one about marrying afterwards. Well, for example, contemporary Roman Catholic scholars will actually use that as an argument to say that the apostolic origin, the oldest practice, the original practice, is mandatory celibacy, or continence. They will argue that the reason why a man was prevented from being ordained, from marrying after ordination, was because of the notion that he needed to prove his ability to be continent. And what they do is they sort of argue, well, then that must mean that the original way was applied, could be reversed, that in fact the original, that the innovation was in permitting a man who was married, who was assumed to have to practice that continence perpetually, that the innovation was in his ability to continue to live his marriage. So I mentioned that a little bit. That's actually the argument of scholars like Kokini, Stefan Hyde, Roman Choly, Alphonse Stickler, so the bigger names, and of course the other contemporary theologians sort of take from that. Whereas we don't really know for sure what the early, there's very scant evidence in the first few hundred years as to exactly what the case was. We simply have the New Testament, which says he must be a husband of one wife. And then we have a lot of silence until about 3rd, 4th century, where it's particularly strong in the West, and with some Eastern voices as well that would argue with it. And then the other question about the monos, the notion of monastic asceticism as opposed to asceticism. I've looked at a little bit about that and why that's the case. And I argue that I'm sort of pointing out that monasticism is baptismal asceticism, but taken to the max, lived in a certain way, but also it's an ecclesial reality. A monk isn't someone who's sort of separate from the normal way of the church, if you will. He's still living that same fidelity to baptism, to asceticism, but in a way that means that he lives monastically. He's unmarried, but not divorced from the marriage, the life of the church in which married couples also find themselves. So I mentioned that a little bit as well. But those are good points, and I think the historical canonical question would need another study. But that's sort of where contemporary Roman Catholic scholars are. They will argue that the requirement of continence following ordination proves the antecedent practice, whereas historically, I think the jury's still very much out, because there's hardly any evidence to that in the first few hundred years or so.
Thank you very much, Joseph. There are a couple of more questions. I'll try to take them in order as they come. There's a question from Gregory in the chat box. He asks, at what point did the need to be married or celibate before becoming a priest come in? And secondly, at what point then did marrieds stop being allowed to become bishops?
Yeah, so the bishop question is another interesting one. I deliberately decided to avoid getting too much into that because I knew that would require a whole separate topic in and of itself. The association of being unmarried and being a bishop. Well, Justinian, for example, starts to mandate it in his rules. But that, of course, doesn't mean, just like with the West, even though there was a canonical rule that a priest had to be continent or celibate later on, that doesn't mean that they stopped having non-continent and married priests, because the rules were often broken in local, and it took a while for it to really become fixed. As scholars will even point out, really only until the seminary system of Trent did you really have certainty that you were ordaining someone, or even then perhaps not, but that you really had certainty that someone was being ordained as a celibate. There are examples of married bishops in the earlier centuries. So he was Gregory of Nyssa's father. I always mix it up whether it's Nis or Nazianzen. I think it's Nissa. His father was believed to have been a married bishop, and there are others as well. One, for example, in I think Egypt, who said he refused to separate from his wife, so he will gladly accept ordination as long as he would be able to stay with his wife, and other evidence even throughout the first millennium. So legally, canonically, we have one requirement, but whether it's being practically observed in various areas of the church, that's another question. And at what point did the need to be married or celibate before ordination? Well, I think that's really the debate. For the first few hundred years, there is no absolute law that we have that survives, that tells us exactly what the case was. We just have, around the time of the 4th century, we have various voices that pop up to say, no, a priest should be, continent, should, or even, not married, and so on. And it was really around, Justinian that says, well, no, bishops have to be unmarried. If they are to be consecrated a bishop, then they have to be separated from their spouses, and their wives have to go off to monasteries, and maybe if they're good, they could be ordained deaconesses. And priests can be, anyone in lower orders from priest downwards can be married as long as they observe continence during their time of service. That's around 692. So in that 7th century there, you have these laws being clarified. But you do have various papal decretals as far as as far back as the 4th century, saying no, that various priests, so in the West, they have a much greater tightening up in the local councils, where they make it very clear that a priest is supposed to be not married, not observing his marriage.
Thank you very much, Father Joseph. Now there's a question waiting from Jeremy. Jeremy.
Hi, fascinating presentation, thank you. Patriarch Athenagoras, in the dialogues with Olivier Clément, which are coming out in July, there's a lot of discussion of the requirement of Orthodox priests to be married before ordination. And he tried on several occasions to change that in the Greek Church and hoped that it would ultimately be changed by the Great Council. And it's interesting, the arguments that he lists against an ordained priest becoming married are very similar to your arguments. The priest is married to his church. The priest cannot be distracted by a wife. It will dilute the priesthood. Very similar arguments to the ones that you've cited, being used in this case in the Greek Orthodox tradition to defend the practice of the priest marrying before ordination. Athenagoras argues that it's a falsehood to compel a young priest to get married and just go and find someone, that marriage should happen when you meet someone you love, and if the person meets the priest, then they want to marry that person who is a priest and accept the priesthood. That's first comment. Just the second one is your comments about the monasticism of marriage. You're probably familiar with what Paul Evdokimov has to say about that, because that's one of his very strong themes, that really there are two forms of monasticism in the religious life. One is that in the monastery, and that the second is that of married life. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yes, Evdokimov features in that 3rd section in my study precisely because he has a great positive presentation of marriage, not as, say, two people who failed to be monks and are observing sort of the default vocation, but as a union which is tantamount to a way of life that is capable of sanctification, of real holiness. That the monastic is someone who is, I use the word, an icon of what the married couple is also trying to do. John Paul II said exactly something very similar in one of his apostolic letters, where he talks a lot about the role of monasticism, in the importance of monasticism in the East as sort of a standard. And Evdokimov speaks really beautifully about that. What I appreciate about Evdokimov is, you come out of it understanding marriage as not being a default. And sometimes, so I talk about accepting with honesty, the baggage of the Christian East. And part of that baggage involves a real preference, a real sense that monastics are superior, and married people, including married priests, are necessarily inferior. Whereas I think Evdokimov and his theology goes to show that that's not quite correct. But you can still retain a theological sense of superiority in the monastic vocation. But that's not to suggest that married people have to become monks in order to become authentically spiritual. And this was the basis of my theology, that a married priest does not have to become a monastic priest in order to become an authentic priest, that he lives his marriage authentically and therefore is doing what the monastic is doing iconically. And so, yes, I'm glad you brought out Evdokimov. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a question waiting from Christoph.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much for the talk. By the way, excellent presentation. I also have lots of questions, but I'll focus on one. I mean, there seems to be an intimate connection between, in the West, between celibacy and the notion of priesthood as Vicarius Christi. And as you know, so the Vicarius Christi approach we can also find in the East, but there are also lots of Orthodox theologians who are actually very critical about this notion, like Bulgakov, for instance, doesn't think that the bishop or the priest represents Christ. Rather, they emphasize more the metaphor of the body of Christ, the church as the body of Christ, and then they differentiate between different charisms within the body of Christ. So if one questions this model of priesthood as Vicarius Christi, then automatically I think celibacy becomes less important or less central, at least. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. It's a simplification, but Western theology is often described as being more Christological or Christomonistic in orientation, and we can definitely see that, not exclusively in the presentation of celibacy, but very heavily. Whereas Eastern theology is often described as being far more pneumatic or pneumatological in orientation. And even in the approach to the liturgical celebration, this is obvious. So when a priest in the Latin West is described as celebrating, he's described as, in the person of Christ, confecting the grace merited by Christ on the cross and applied to the people. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, the liturgical tradition is approached more pneumatologically. So I enter into, because I am transformed by the grace of the Spirit into a member of the body of Christ, I enter into the eschatological celebration that is taking place. And therefore, it's probably a little too simplistic to use active versus passive, but there are two different approaches. And therefore, how to interpret the priest is different. And therefore, perhaps how celibacy has been strengthened or solidified in its association with the priesthood could be down to something like that. Even the way, for example, the priest turns first facing the people versus facing the east. Could that have contributed to this in some way, even in an iconic manner? It's possible, yes, and I would make some associations regarding that.
Thank you very much. Now there's a question in the chat box waiting from Mark Chenoweth. And he's asking, do you think the persona Christi is a good way to think of the priesthood from an Eastern perspective? And does the married priesthood negate the idea of the priest symbolizing Christ, the bridegroom, at the liturgy? Now, I know you've touched on that already, but would you like to add something to Mark's question?
So I'm not sure that an exclusive focus of the in persona Christi is the best way. From the Eastern perspective, I think, yeah, as I've mentioned, it is Christological, but it's also pneumatological, and so scholars will point that out. So, for example, the priest can also be described as acting in persona ecclesiae as well as in persona Christi. The married priesthood doesn't negate the idea of the priest symbolizing Christ the bridegroom, because again, if the priest is the one entering into that which has been manifest by Christ, then he enters into it, but he enters into it as a married man, just as, say, a lay baptized married man enters into the liturgical reality of that which has been offered by Christ. I think in the East, because of that wider approach to the liturgy, there isn't such a minutely focused or tunnel vision focus of what the priesthood is. There's a far more multifaceted understanding of the liturgy. So as something that is entered into, as something that is unveiled, as opposed to something that is offered or celebrated. So there is a difference in approach there. That's just to generalize.
Okay, there are questions from Gregory again and Father Patrick. Do go ahead, Gregory.
Hello, everybody. In terms of the actual discussion and the debate, I've got actual observations, because I lived, before discovering Orthodoxy, in a Christian community I was part of for 20 years, of which we had marrieds and celibates living together, both brothers and sisters, using the married couples as a divider between the single women and the single men, and depending on the particular house layout. And one of the observations that I can offer to this debate is that the marrieds obviously had their worldly concerns, because they looked after each other, and if they had kids, there was those concerns as well. But to the best of their ability, they would be available. But as the arguments are recorded historically from the people mentioned, the celibates were able, at the drop of the hat, to serve the church if something was needed. They had no other concerns. Although some of the celibates were looking after the kids to give the married parents a break. So there was pros and cons, and that's sometimes, when you're living in that proximity, the need of the church is for them to help the marrieds in their married life and to serve them by being available. I was in that community for 10 years as a single man, 2 of which I was as an inquirer into celibacy, and then the last 10 years as a married man, now with 5 kids. So I've got some real life experience of both, and I've seen both played out. But I've seen the celibates who really do seem empowered by their sacrifice of a married life, both women and men, who have been amazing people of God, and celibates who are more, guess that they thought they would be left on the shelf, and not so empowered. And I've seen marrieds also availing themselves of their gift in receiving that to the fullness, and being very effective for God, as well as all their worldly and normal natural cares. So it's possibly as much on the person and the individual as it is the gift or calling, however you see marriage or celibacy. but I think they're definitely two sides of the same coin. How would we see it? How do we perceive it in terms of gifts and callings?
Okay, well, we're running out of time. Actually,
Sorry.
No, it's not your fault. We've actually run out of time, but we still have time for a few questions. Let's take John, because he hasn't had the chance to ask any question yet.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Brilliant talk, and I'll keep this very brief because I'm conscious of time. But very quickly, what are the implications of this for the sacrament of reconciliation? So, for example, a priest is sent to a village. He's married, and his wife wants to go confess her sin. Does she confess to her husband, the priest? And if she does, what if she wants to confess about the marriage? So very, very practical question, I suppose, but where do those sorts of practicalities factor into this study in terms of those implications?
It's a very good question. My wife asks me that too, and others ask her whether she comes to me, and we both say no, because I already know her sins, and I don't need her to confess any of them. I could tell them to her before she brings them out. But I suppose it is possible, in the sense that I would be the spiritual father of a parish to which she also belongs. At the same time, if I remember correctly, even from the old Roman Catholic manuals, I mean, there were certain moral restrictions that were allowed in preventing people from making an integral confession. So if a priest were in a hospital, for example, and say the ward were in a public setting, is the person morally required to make an integral confession, even that other people might hear? That even those old manuals of the Roman Catholic tradition would say that no, there are some restrictions that could be admitted. Now, I don't want to go too much into that, but that's just to show that our understanding of what needs to happen versus what might not have to happen at that particular case is something that has been discussed for a long time, even in the Latin West. And so I would never, for example, in that case, demand something that's, say, morally impossible or difficult, because a person is entitled to find a spiritual confessor to whom they can go and make an integral confession. Just as if I were a missionary by myself and I had access to no other minister, well, I would simply have to wait and say my prayers and ask my forgiveness and live the best life that I can. So I think not to be too constrained by the question, even though it's a very good one. It's the kind of stuff that we would learn about in seminary.
Thank you very much. And one last question, Father Patrick, if you can make it or your comment very short.
Sorry, many questions. All right, the other thing I was thinking about working on is the idea of exclusivity of the priest's relationship to the church and the married, if you do miss married sense, because the priest does stand as Christ in relation to his wife. So that relationship's already there. And I don't know if it's necessary, you could develop an argument that one doesn't exclude the other. You could say there's a higher level or a more extended level of the one towards the church, but that doesn't exclude the one that's already established in marriage, so that the two are compatible and can be lived together, because he is still Christ in the same regard. And I think also on top of that, the idea of the priest as father. So he's not only just simply Christ as the Son of God in relationship to the church, he is also steps in as a sense as a father, begetting children through the preaching, through the baptisms, through the confession, as we just mentioned before. So the role of fatherhood there, and as also coupled in with the married relationship of fatherhood. So, but I think the main thing is that why is there a need for exclusivity? Because he's fulfilling both roles in both senses. And so that was my last point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Patrick. Thank you. Yes, I mentioned some of that. Actually, some Eastern scholars have made that argument and have pointed that out, that when a married priest relates to his wife, he does so as to a member of the church. And so even as a married man, even another married man relates to his spouse as a member of the church would do to another member of the church. And so that doesn't go away. So the priesthood doesn't, separate that former, you could say, well, even as ordination to the priesthood does not efface your baptism. It leaves that intact. It leaves your fundamental ecclesial identity in place. It just adds a new dimension to it. So the same way with the priest relating to his wife as a married man and relating to the church as now a priest.
Thank you very much. But I think, dear friends, the time has come, sadly, to call this a day. Thank you very much, Father Joseph, for your wonderful presentation. And thank you all for your very equally interesting questions. I think we've had a very fruitful and enriching conversation today.